Welcome to the Living a Life Well Fed podcast. I'm your host, Ariana Youmans Keenahan, and I'm so excited to bring you your number one podcast for all things breastfeeding, family life, and business. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode. And for those of you who are celebrating, happy National Breastfeeding Week. This is one of my favorite weeks of the entire year, including International Breastfeeding Week, which is the first week of August. And it's such a great time to recognize, honor, and really celebrate breastfeeding and the huge impacts that it has around the world. And with it being National Breastfeeding Week, I realized that I've never shared my story on the podcast about why I became a breastfeeding mother in the first place. And I really wanted to share it because it's super important. Not so much why breastfeeding is important. I think many of us know why that's important. But how I was inspired to become a breastfeeding mother is important, and how that has really played into what I've gone on to do in adulthood, not just as a breastfeeding mother, but as a business owner and as someone who is a breastfeeding advocate making positive change. So here goes. I grew up, first, I would have had a camera given to me at the age of 4, I believe, and I loved it. Like, truly loved it so much. I would take pictures of like my little doll in her stroller next to my pony, like my real pony. And later I would take photographs of my Barbies in their Barbie home and write stories to go along with them. And it's so funny because the things that we are drawn to as children, we are drawn to for a reason. And oftentimes we are just told that that's like child's play, or, we'll grow out of it, or, we'll get a real job one day, or we'll do something a bit more serious. And it just turns out that that's exactly what I've ended up doing with my life. After, of course, following a very wild, different path that was totally unrelated, but yet has influenced what I do now. And it's just unreal how really what we loved as children can come back and be our life's path. So now I take photographs of families in their home and tell their story. And I was highly influenced, without even realizing it, to be a breastfeeding mother by a photograph. So there was a photographer who went around and she photographed women ranchers in the US. And she put together this book called Hard Twist. And the photographer's name is Barbara Van Cleve. If you ever wanted to look this up, it's an incredible book. Highly recommend it. But she had gone through her own path of not following photography. And I believe it was her mother who encouraged her to go into the world of education instead. And so she did that. And I think she was probably in her 60s whenever she decided to do this book. And it took her maybe 5 years to go from, going around and photographing these families to actually creating the book. And I grew up with this book on our coffee table in my family's home. And there's a photograph in it of my Aunt Mary, and she's feeding my cousin Sarah. This is like 1988. And it's a photograph of her with her cowboy hat on. My Aunt Mary, she had her cowboy hat on. She's sitting in the shade of a car, and she's feeding my cousin Sarah, who I think she said was maybe around 9 months old at that time. And I grew up seeing that photograph, and it so normalized breastfeeding for me. And it so normalized this idea that I came from a breastfeeding family without saying a word. Like, the photograph spoke for not just breastfeeding, it spoke for our family lineage, because my grandmother had also breastfed all 6 of her children, including feeding her sister's children. Like, if her sister had to run out and do errands, she would have fed her sister's children as well, if, needs called for it. So I grew up with that photograph, and I grew up seeing that. And there are other photographs of my Aunt Mary in that book, like other amazing photographs of her. But that was the one that I was always drawn to. And that was the one that anytime I opened the book, I always had to turn to. And I was just fascinated by it. And you can't really see much of anything because it's just her shirt lifted up to feed Sarah. But I knew that that's what it was. And to be honest, for most of what I saw in America, like, I don't ever really remember seeing breastfeeding apart from that photograph. I would have been around a lot of bottles, whether that was in toy stores and little baby dolls having bottles to go with them, or just people using bottles to feed their babies. So it really was something that stood out to me, and I'm so thankful that I had it, because otherwise I'm not sure that I would have had many other breastfeeding influences. And fast forward to me becoming a mother, I did not have the birth that I thought I would have. And if you are a birthing parent who is listening to this, you might identify with that and understand what that feels like. So I had anticipated having a home birth, but had an unplanned cesarean like 26 or so hours after my waters broke. And I was able to labor for the most part at home. And then they make you transfer in after a certain stage because they want to prevent things like infection happening. So anyway, I ended up having a cesarean, which was so not at all what I thought was going to happen. I felt like my body had failed me, but breastfeeding worked. And it was the one thing that I could anchor to remind myself that my body had not failed me or him, and it was not failing us. In fact, it was working and it was supporting his life still outside of the womb. And that was so powerful. Like, it transformed so much for me. I really probably couldn't put the importance of that in words enough. And actually, it meant so much to me, and it was so much of my identity that it's also the reason why I chose not to go back to work. I tried to get flexible working arrangements, and I was not able to succeed in those negotiations. And so I decided that I was going to pick up my camera again, and I was going to support breastfeeding families with it. And I was going to do business on my terms and motherhood on my terms. And I chose that I wanted to be a mother, and I wanted to be a breastfeeding mother who didn't have to interrupt that bond and that relationship by being at an office job. And I know that there are many mothers that do choose that, and that's the right choice for them. But for me, it just was not. And so I started Well-Fed Photography, and let's see, about 2 years in, I believe, I also had my daughter, and I was feeding her a few months after she was born, and just heard this voice. Like, it was kind of in the middle of the night when I was doing a night feed, and I just heard this, this like internal voice that just said, it's time. And I really understood. It's so funny. There was no extra words or explanation to it, but I just understood exactly what it meant. It meant I was supposed to do a book about breastfeeding, and I was supposed to really own the fact that I wanted to be a breastfeeding photographer and have that be the focus of the services that I provide to families. And it's funny because I'm now almost 5 years in business, and I've spent 2 years creating this book about breastfeeding stories from families across Ireland. If you don't know about that, I will leave a link in the show notes so you can find out more and support our breastfeeding publications. But this book called Bainne, Cíche, Stories of Breastfeeding Ireland, I'm creating that, and I realize that there's still so much that I would like to change, like on my website and in other ways that people are connected to the business, because I've still in a lot of ways shied away from truly owning that for fear of it turning some people off from the business, or for fear of it hurting someone's feelings who didn't have that successful breastfeeding journey that they really wanted, or for someone who feels like a failure because they fed their child formula instead of breastfeeding. And of course, by focusing on breastfeeding, I'm not actually saying any of that, but my fear has been for so long that people would end up feeling left out, upset, and hurt by the fact that I chose to put a spotlight on breastfeeding and really honor and document it. And I have had such a recent push as well to embrace it even more and to really own that that's what I want to do. A fellow photographer friend, actually Marie Amani, she's been on the podcast before on season 1, and she asked recently, like, if money was, not an issue at all, regardless of what you photographed, you would still have enough money to like pay your bills and have more than enough, what would you photograph? And for me, it was photographing breastfeeding and family life, and also photographing families that have some kind of quote unquote non-typical factor about them, whether it's like same-sex couples who have a family, whether it's a family where there is gender diversity, neurodiversity, or neurodivergence, families where there are disabilities. Like, I truly care about documenting that. because obviously I'm in the world of photography and I see photography all the time. It's constantly brought up on my social media, and whatever the Facebook changes they did recently, it's like nonstop showing other photography on my feed. And the thing is, I understand implicitly that not every disability is something that is visible. I absolutely understand that. And yet, I so rarely see those visible disabilities represented in photographs and family photographs. And so I feel a strong urge to be a voice for those and to be a safe space for families with disabilities to also enjoy beautiful family photographs of their bonds and their connections. So that is something that I care about as well and would love to dive more into. But yeah, breastfeeding, like it's time for me to step it up and show that too. I'm so thankful for that photograph because it really changed my life, the photograph of my Aunt Mary. And my hope is that by having this book series with photographs and stories, that it will go on to positively impact many other lives as well, including children who are seeing the books and seeing the photographs and being exposed to that very early in life so that they can make a decision that feels really easy for them, feels really natural. It doesn't feel like it's in conflict with the rest of the world or with society or with whatever may be trendy and popular at the time. But if they would like to breastfeed or have a partner that breastfeeds or use donor milk, that they know that those options are there. I think that's the most important thing, is that people recognize they have options. And it may sound silly, but I think there are many, 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 many people out there in this world, especially children, who do not realize that a woman's breast can be a form of sustenance and feeding for a child. They just think that comes from bottles. And so to show them an alternative and to show them options, I think is one of the most empowering and powerful things ever. And I'll leave you with this one last story before I finish off the podcast. And that is that I was at a wedding recently. Actually, one of the storytellers that's going to be in one of our Bainne books, she was getting married and invited me to the wedding, and it was amazing. And I was attending by myself, and there was another woman there who had 2 children, and I saw that she was baby wearing and breastfeeding, and I was like, right, like I found another person here who I have something that I know I can connect with them about. So I did connect with her, and it was amazing to hear her story about breastfeeding. She's originally from Ireland, but living in the UK and had her children in the UK. And I asked her what influenced her to breastfeed, and she said there was a photograph of my mother and my aunt breastfeeding me and my cousin. And I grew up seeing that, and that really influenced me. And it was like lightning struck through me. It was like the universe giving me this massive form of validation that what I'm doing does matter, and what I'm doing will be of service and support, that what I'm doing is a form of advocacy, and it also is a form of normalizing something that truly I personally feel is the norm and should be considered the norm. And again, that's not at all like I've written a blog post in depth about the fact that we need to throw away the verses when it comes to breastfeeding versus formula and just abolish that completely. But for me, breastfeeding, which is a biological, physiological norm, should be allowed to be that. People that choose to breastfeed should not be outcast from society or outcast from a restaurant or a public place or sent away when it comes to feeding their child that way. And my hope is that by having this book and these stories, that positive change will come, whether that is through normalizing it and having it be more socially accepted and understood, whether it's through having other people make a decision that feels really in alignment for them and they feel like they can have access to the support that they need, or that when people are struggling, they can read these stories and feel like, okay, maybe they don't know these people, the storytellers personally, but that they have almost this friend or this confidant or this community that they can lean on, even in the form of a book, to know that they are not alone in their challenges or their struggles or their choice. So that is what I'm leaving you with this National Breastfeeding Week 2022. And for anyone who has shared their story for the book series, I wanted to say a big thank you. For people that are out there just feeding and being visible when feeding, or not, like people that just feed in their home or in more private places, like maybe they go to their car to feed. I really appreciate you, and I wanted say thank you for doing what feels right for you, for doing something you feel is supportive of your little one or little ones and your family, and for helping to improve the health of society, and for so many other things, like for working towards a more empathetic, more connected, more bonded, more in tune with society and next generation. And I appreciate you. I love you. And for everyone that's listening, I just want to say thank you to you as well. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And if you love this episode, share it with someone that you love. If you love this episode, share it with other parents that you think would get a lot out of this. Or maybe you know a photographer friend who is not photographing what he or she or they would like to be photographing and is not really owning that. You can share this episode with them too and say, hey, look, she's been there. She's still going through it, and she's still learning how to truly own what she wants to photograph and what she wants her personal legacy to be through the work that she does and through the artwork that she creates. So thank you so much, and stick around for a product recommendation of the week. I hope you have an amazing week ahead, and I send you so much love. Thank you so much. All the best. Bye-bye. So with it being National Breastfeeding Week, I wanted our product recommendation to be a breastfeeding one. And what I'm recommending is the Haakaa silicone breast pump. And if you have never heard of this, it's like a silicone breast pump. It's not an electric breast pump, but it changed my life with my second. And I wish I had known about it with my first. Too much information, but I would leak so much when I had my first. I had a massive oversupply. And I had those little like baby cups, those little like plastic baby cups, and would literally just catch the breast milk that was dripping out of my other breast while I was feeding my son. And this went on for like ages. At 1.5 years, I was still wearing like breast pads and things like that. So the Haakaa would have made a big difference for me because it would have been such an easier form of collecting milk, which you can then use for bath time, you can use for nappy rash, you can use for skin irritation or cuts or ear infections or blocked noses. Like it has so many uses. And yeah, I was just like catching it with just this little infant baby cup. So I'm recommending the Haakaa. It made such a difference with my second, and I actually ended up purchasing 2 just so if one was in the process of cleaning and I needed it, I would have the other one. So I will leave the link for that in the show notes, and I hope that you enjoy it. If you have a friend who's expecting and they plan to breastfeed, it's a great gift to give them if they don't already have one or if they haven't heard about it. I actually ended up donating. Now, I don't think you can donate to the milk bank. I'm not sure. That may have changed since the last time I checked, but there is some discrepancy about whether or not you can donate to the milk bank while expressing with the Haakaa, but I was able to donate via Human Milk for Human Babies to quite a number of families because I had oversupply again with my second, and my freezer was just full. So I was able to donate to a family where the mother had a brain tumor and she was having treatment, which prevented her from being able to feed her son. And I donated to another family I donated to before, but she actually ended up being able to have a more successful breastfeeding journey, as in her supply was greater that next time around. So she was able to donate that to the first family I mentioned. And I don't know, I honestly at this stage between my first child and my second, I couldn't tell you the number of people and families that I donated to, but it was made so much easier by having the Haakaa and being able to just capture that from the other breast while I was feeding. So it was a wonderful thing to donate. The Haakaa made it so much easier, and I would recommend it to anyone who intends to breastfeed, and whether they intend to pump or not, like with an electric pump, it's just a great thing to have. So highly recommend it. Enjoy, and I'll chat with you next week. All the best. Bye.